Hello, let's talk about detents. Now, the first question is, what is a detent? And a detent on a folding knife is simply the pressure of the blade, the pressure of the knife to keep the blade closed when you're not using it. So let's first take a look at the axis lock. And the way it accomplishes its detent is having this crossbar, which is spring-loaded, run up against a sort of angled plane, which is the back of the blade. So you can see that when I try to open the knife, it pushes positively against the springs, which push the pillar back this way, to keep the blade closed. Obviously, you overcome the detent to open the knife. Why is the detent important? Pretty simple. When the knife is in your pocket, you don't want it to open. Or when you're not using it, you don't want it to be open. The secondary purpose of a detent is it makes it easier to open, which is to say, it's easier to open the knife when you can overcome the detent in a very crisp manner. For example, the detent on this knife, you overcome all at once to sort of fling it out really fast. What that means is a stronger detent both A, makes the knife safer in your pocket because you're less likely to have it open when you don't want it to, and B, make it fly out even faster because you're overcoming a stronger force. Now, if you have a pocket clip and you use this in your right pocket, it will sort of be buried against the wall of your pocket anyways. So that's to say that even if the detent gets broken, so the blade is like slightly clipped open, right? If it's in the corner of your pocket, if you reach your hand in your pocket to grab something else, it should be the case that you don't ever run into the blade anyways, and the corner of your pants should actually keep it closed. But that's beside the point. Maybe you're not running the pocket clip and it's just sitting in the bottom of your pants. You don't want it to open when you're not using it. So that's why a detent matters. Now, there are different kinds of detents, and they sort of two broad categories of different detents. The sort of detent that I was talking about earlier, where it sort of sucks the blade back in to a certain point. Like if I let go here, the blade gets pulled back in. And there are detents that do not do that, which are just like sort of like more like a tangent, or sort of like a singular point at which you overcome it, as opposed to a sort of gradient of like sucking power. It's hard to explain, but you'll see what I'm talking about as I get into it. So it sort of arises from the structure of the knife. Again, the axis lock sort of has it by pushing against an angled part of the tang. As you can see down there, that little hook is what creates the detent, because the bar needs to overcome that hook. The crossbar needs to overcome that hook in order to open the knife. You can see it in here. That hook sort of forces the bar down. But once the blade gets past that hook, the blade is not going to be sucked back in. But once you get past it the other way, the springs of the lock pull the blade back in. The other knife that sort of I've got here is the Buck 110, which reaches a back lock, which is just to say it's a long piece of metal that runs the length of the spine of the handle, which is a lever which is based off of right here, this pin right there. It's spring loaded. You can actually see the spring in there. Well, maybe you can't, it's a little dark, but it's spring loaded such that, it's a button, essentially. But it's like a lever. And then the end of the lever has a little, notch, or protrusion, essentially, that will fall into that little divot in the tang of the blade down there. So if I use the 940 as a pointer, in there's a little divot, which the protrusion from the back side, the inside of this bar, will sort of fall into, the lock bar will fall into at the top to lock it open. And then you release it by pressing back here on the lever, which lifts it out of the pocket of the tang to close it. Similar to the 940, there's a bit of an angled surface, a gradient, as you can see on the bottom of the tang on the front of the blade, which means that the lock bar providing constant pressure against the blade sort of helps suck in the blade once you get past right about here. Yeah. That again is sort of like a positive detent in that it sort of has like a sucking power, a staying power, which is to say that even if it gets knocked out, it'll get pulled back in. The other sort of detent is sort of like just like an instance of force. So it's created by a ball on a liner lock or a frame lock, and essentially there's a little tiny ball on that frame. You can see it just barely there on it's a little black dot essentially, and it falls into a little hole in the blade, like in the blade stock below the handle. So when the blade is closed, you can hear that the ball has fallen into its hole. This means that like the positive force or the sucking power only happens really, really low. You can see that the blade is barely open right now, and it just there like gets sucked in. Whereas with the 940, I can have it open, you know, like probably almost 15-20 degrees before it gets sucked in. Probably even more for the buck. Yeah, so about the same. Yeah, 20 degrees or so. Whereas this guy, it's more like 5. What this means is that the detent is very crisp. So whereas this one, I have to overcome this sort of sucking power all the way through, and then the blade will open. Or same thing here, like I have to overcome, and then it will sort of slide open. This one, I can just overcome it as a single instance, which allows it to be flipped open very fast when you crack the detent all at once. So in this case, the detent being very strong and being a single instance allows you to build up pressure on the flipper so you can fling it open perfectly every single time. The sort of drawback to this kind of detent, although it allows you to get very crisp deployments, is that because it is only a single instance, if over time the detent becomes loose, or maybe it's just not designed very well, or manufactured well, unlike this Kershaw, then it has a greater tendency to sort of pop itself open because it doesn't have the positive like sort of power to sort of like suck itself back in, suck the blade back in, like either of the two knives on either side of it. So you do kind of trade off a little bit of safety from the sort of positive retention of these knives. And also like old slip joints will also have that positive retention. These are not the only knives that have positive retention. And this is definitely not the only one without it. Basically all frame lock and liner lock knives have this kind of detent, whereas back locks, crossbar locks, and Judenko's shark lock, slip joints all have the other sort of retention. So yeah, the trade-off is speed and crispness of deployment for a little bit of safety. Now this is to say it's still very, very safe. It's very difficult to shake this knife open. I'm sure that if I got a huge shake going, I could probably get it open. So it's not like it's wildly, wildly unsafe, but is perhaps less likely to last a very long time because it's reliant on a tiny little piece of metal falling into a tiny little hole in the metal. So maybe if the walls of that hole get worn down over time through years and years of usage, then it would become less of a secure system to keep the blade closed. This is again sort of like counteracted by the pocket clip orientation, which is why whenever you get a Benchmade, for example, there'll be a little blue card that they tuck under the pocket clip, which will say, please flip the pocket clip if you're going to use it on the other side of your pants. But yeah. So I think that if you care a lot about keeping the knife shut when you're not in use, you should look for a lock that sort of guarantees this sort of positive retention force, like a back lock or an axis lock or any sort of other crossbar lock or whatever the other locks I mentioned earlier. But if you want just crisp deployment, then liner locks and frame locks can oftentimes beat out these two locks in that they have this sort of immediate instance of retention as opposed to a gradient that exists over time. Yeah, that's what a detent is. And it's, yeah, there are different kinds of detents and different kinds of knives, and they exist for different purposes, and they manifest in different ways. Certain knives, like the CRKT Fulcrum, for example, is a double detent knife, which is that there is no lock. When it's open, it's just two sides of the liner sort of have detent balls that click into holes in the blade, and then when it's closed, those two balls click into the blade when it's closed. So you can just crack the detent to open it and crack the detent to close it. But those are sort of other kinds of knives. Well, I hope that answered any of the questions that you had about detents. And if you have any more, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.